Hello, everyone. So, as you know, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary, and we have a wonderful keynote here for you today. This is going to be Esteban Kelly. He's the Executive Director of the United States Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Hold on. But he is also a past NASCO staff member, a past NASCO board member, and altogether spent 10 years working with NASCO. Yeah, that deserves a round of applause if I heard. Not only that, but Esteban is a co-opper through and through. He's lived in a co-op in Philadelphia. He's worked at worker co-ops in Berkeley and the housing co-ops in Berkeley. He's an amazing, wonderful mentor of mine, and I am so proud to welcome him to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, you guys. Hi, this is so good to be here. So we're going to do a few things, and it's going to be fun. And I promise that even though we're covering a lot of stuff today, I feel like I'm lecturing in one of these like public university, like I went to Berkeley for my undergrad, and I often had giant classes that were in a room this size. So I'm like, we have a lot of material to cover. You can get out a notepad if you want, or you can just chill and pay attention. And there'll be a lot of opportunity to follow up here, but also what we're doing is we're sort of going to ride this train together. There's a lot of different stops, and I think what we're going to do for this little keynote moment is stay on the train, but I'm gonna sort of, I'm from New York, so I'm having like a subway metaphor happening in my mind right now. I'll sort of announce where these different stops are and be like, hey, by the way, there's a workshop about this that Steve Dubb is doing after the... So there's moments throughout this weekend where we can pick up on some of the little nuggets that I'm gonna drop as we move through. The other thing is, it's not all my hopes and dreams, but we're gonna be a little bit multimodal. Am I supposed to put this on, by the way, for the... Okay, great. So I'm going to do some storytelling, we're going to do some slides, and we're also going to do a little bit of like pair share, talking to your neighbor, because I have some questions to get into for you guys. That is why no one's going to be bored. That's my commitment to you. So thank you for that introduction, and I also want to recognize, where are the board members for NASCO, those of you who are in the room? That's wonderful. Can we give some love to these folks? And then keep your hands up. If there are people who are also on the boards for NDS or for NP, it'd be good to see who you are as well. Yeah, all right, cool. That's great. So thanks y'all for bringing me here. I also was going to have a moment of recognizing Washtenaw County and where we're based here in Southeast Michigan, but Rati did such a beautiful job of doing that I'm going to kind of skip through that to recognizing another keynote speaker who predated me, and I don't remember what year she spoke, but Grace Lee Boggs was, many of you know about her work, and so she actually took on the name of her partner, Jimmy Boggs, who was a revolutionary, black revolutionary from Detroit. Grace Lee was Chinese American and lived to the ripe old age of 99. And she came and keynoted, I think it was either the last time that I planned the conference or the first time my successor did, or something like that. There was a bit of a handoff there. And I'm thinking of Grace, and I'm thinking there's probably going to be a few moments where I holler at various keynotes throughout time for NASCO Institute. I'm thinking of Grace because one of the lessons that she shared, I think on this stage, but also in a lot of her organizing, was that when she was young, she thought about social change in the context of campaigns. And I resonated with that. As a student organizer, I often thought about things from semester to semester. Like, we're working on this thing, and then what are we going to do in spring? And then nothing happens in the summer, but we'll be back in the fall. And she's like, and then as I got older, I started thinking about things about organizing and social change in terms of the arc of years, that things sort of go, it's a longer pace than just a campaign. And then she said, once I got to middle age, which I'm not quite there, but I'm sort of like knocking on the door of 40s, I'm on my way. That she's like, then, once I was in my 40s and 50s, I started thinking about change in terms of decades. It was like, oh yeah, wait, this stuff doesn't change in a campaign or year to year. That change happens in this longer arc of time. And you can think about like what was accomplished throughout the 70s, or what was possible through the 1940s, or through the 1990s. So we're gonna do a little bit of that today. And then she hit like her 80s and was still mentoring a lot of people in the movement and organizing till the day she died, actually. And she's like, now I think about change in terms of centuries, straight up. And I think that that's really, she wasn't being glib, right? She wasn't like, now that I'm 99 years old, here's how I think about change. But she really was like, if you look at the arc, for example, of civil rights organizing, or looking at different iterations of feminism and confronting patriarchy and sexism, that a lot of what was started, a lot of what was achieved in the, let's just say the 70s, started like in the 1870s for women. And so there's all these ways that we need to sort of zoom out a little bit beyond the scale of our own individual lives or even of like human passing of time, but also looking at the collectivity, that we're sort of part of this larger thing. And I open by sharing that because this is the 50th anniversary of NASCO's founding in 1968. And there's a way of sort of looking back at 1968. We're going to look at that in a minute, at what that year marked. This NASCO isn't the only thing that came out in 1968, right? This is a touchstone and a really pivotal moment in history of planet Earth that all boil down to one particular year and the importance of youth and students. And actually, NASCO wasn't separate from that, but sort of grew out of this similar crucible, this inflection point in history. So here we are 50 years later. And if we think about what Grace Lee Boggs was saying, we're about halfway toward the change and toward realizing the intentions of what that inflection point was. So what we're going to do together, and lucky for you guys, I'm sort of an expert in time travel and thinking in like big visionary stuff. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to help you with this, is we're going to look back 50 years, march through that time together to today, and then we're also going to project forward 50 years. Because where we really are, it's not so much, wow, it's been 50 years, awesome, high fives, look what we did. It's like we're in the middle of a really critical, pivotal moment in figuring out how the hell we're going to come together and live and survive on this planet and be in right relationship with the ecosystem, with one another, in a way that's inclusive, that's sustainable, and where we're all free. And so in order to do that, and I think that was a lot of the premise of 1968, and wow, we have maybe like 50 years to go, huh? Like that may be where we're located in that. And it's also a moment where a lot about, let's just say 2018, is coming into relief for people. Like it just is making more sense to more people that this moment matters a lot. I was getting obnoxious text messages, even on my way here yesterday, from random organizers from like Next Gen and Move On and all these different groups who were saying, hey bro, you gonna vote? And I replied, of course, stop bothering me. And they're like, remind your family and friends. So I'm gonna do one better, which is that those of you who are eligible to vote in the United States, I'm going to encourage you to vote, and then they'll stop bothering me on the text messages. So we have elections coming up on Tuesday, and I know that we're in this wonderful, beautiful community with so many people from different countries, a lot of Canadians here, and even a lot of people who are either underage or undocumented, or who are documented but don't have citizenship. And so like that's part of what makes us beautiful. And so those of us who can vote are also, we need to do that on behalf of all the people who are like, y'all, we have some work to do. Okay, so we're still on title slide. Let's go to the next slide, Okay. Here's what we're gonna do. In a moment, I'm gonna ask you to share with a buddy, with a neighbor, a book that you're reading right now. By that I mean, a lot of you are students. I don't mean like what's something that someone assigned to you. I mean like what's something that you're reading because you wanted to. That's like fun and awesome. That's like getting your juices going. And it doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction, because I'm gonna share, I think, a bit from 2 or maybe 3 books that I'm reading right now, and that kind of is informing my thinking about this. So what's behind me on the slides is this, it's a timeline that is telling a story at 3 different levels, and that relates to a book that I'm reading now, and I think the last time I read it, I think it was the year that I came to NASCO Institute for the first time, which was 2000. So I haven't read this book in 18 years. And I just started rereading it. It's called The Dispossessed, and it's by another really amazing thinker and beautiful mentor who we also lost recently, Ursula K. Le Guin. For those of you who have heard of her or who've heard of her books, one of the things that I learned, I think like 7 books after being familiar with her work, is that the K in her name isn't a middle initial, it's from her maiden name, which is Kroeber, which comes from her dad, who was a really important and famous anthropologist. And when I was mentioning being in like giant lecture halls in Berkeley, one of them was for my anthropology course, my intro anthropology course. So again, I was like at exactly the age that many of you are as undergrads. And the anthropology department was housed in a building called Kroeber Hall. Turns out that was her dad. And so it suddenly cast everything into this whole other light where it was like, oh, here's this really visionary woman who's using the mode of science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction to draw out some very critical lessons about our very real world and what she was seeing in social movements and politics and just the communities around her. And she's bringing this lens from the perspective as a daughter of an anthropologist. And so looking back at her books, and the one that I'm reading right now is called The Dispossessed, she is drawing out all of these connections around what does it mean to encounter something kind of from this anthropological lens. Having a protagonist, and in this particular book, it's somebody who's a physicist from a sort of moon co-planet system that has basically been settled by anarchists who have chosen to go there. They're like, we're leaving your world of wild inequality, the abundant planet, and we're going to this moon, and we're just sealing ourselves off, and we're going to do our own thing and live in this free, liberated society where no one owns anything, hence dispossession. And so this physicist on this planet is experimenting with this whole new methodology around time. It's sort of equivalent to the Einsteinian revolution of thinking about relativity and physics. And so he's developing this principle called simultaneity, in which, and she's doing this beautiful fractal thing where every chapter of the book is flashing back to before he leaves and becomes this sort of like anthropologist ambassador on this other planet, and then talking about his time where he's on the big planet that his people had left like 150 years ago. And so the story itself is sort of spliced in time or interspliced, and his theory is about how time isn't sequential, but it's actually simultaneous, or that both of those things are true at the same time. That we're both able to, the present only makes sense insofar as we are tied to the past and we're tied to the future. that our ideas of economy or loyalty or even relationships, they get into like romantic relationships in the story, are premised on thinking about ourselves in the moment as being tied to a future and also rooted in a past. And so he's drawing on that stuff. And I say that partially because I'm coming back to that later, but also because what I'm going to do is tell this story that also has these three different layers of time sort of superimposed on each other. One is looking at social movement history, and I think that 1968 is a really great point of departure, even though what I've learned about anthropology is that there's no such thing as origins. There's no like moment when things began, and that's true for NASCO as well. We can talk about that. I guess there's a panel tomorrow morning. See, this is one of those like, stand clear of the closing doors. There's an exit there. Tomorrow morning there's a panel that looks in more depth at the history of NASCO itself. And some of that might actually get at what that prehistory was of NASCO, and the more that I'm learning as a board member for the National Cooperative Business Association, which just celebrated its 100th anniversary. So speaking of this, like thinking about centuries and what we accomplish from that larger point of view, that the prehistory of NASCO goes back to the 30s and 40s even, and moments of student cooperative organizing. The other thing is talking specifically about social solidarity, economy, and cooperative movements. And then the third is more autobiographical. It's sort of like, where does my story fit into this? Because there's a version of Liz's introduction or me introducing myself where I sort of start with, here's who I am and how I'm tied to a bunch of things. But I think it's going to be more interesting to sort of explore that as we move through this bigger story. And so I'll give you the signals as we go through it of when I'm toggling between this broader arc of social movements, the history of NASCO and what cooperative and solidarity economy movements have been doing, at least for the last 50 years, and then my own. And then of course where we're gonna go is time traveling forward, right? So we're gonna do that leading up to the now and then project forward a little bit. The other thing I wanted to say. Okay, can we go to the next slide? All right, so I asked you to think about your book. The other thing I'm gonna ask you to think about is how you enter into thinking about, and I'm being a little bit lazy and collapsing everything into just like social or economic justice, but how you enter into conversations about, let's just say, wanting to build a better world. And I'm being very presumptuous in presuming that we're all here because we want to build a better world, all right? And so there's 4 different ways. You could think about this as sort of like we're about to go through the sorting hat at Hogwarts. This is like a Harry Potter moment that's about to happen. And here are the four options. And the thing is, just like the sorting hat, you gotta pick. Like, even if you're like, oh yeah, Hermione is like, could be a Ravenclaw, she's like a little intellectual, a little nerdy, but ultimately, at the end of the day, she's a Gryffindor, all right? So we all ideally should have components of all of these things, but here's what we got. Entering, the primary driver, the thing that really hooked you and brought you into movements was around a moral entry point, which is like around believing. You could think about Dr. King as an example of this, of like, okay, I want the world to be a better place because I believe that that's right, like that there's something like spiritually, ethically that resonates, like that's really what got me. Or, these are the Ravenclaws, is it intellectual? Is it knowing, the more you learned about the world, about wealth inequality, about unequal distribution of resources, about hunger, climate change, how much water it takes to make a pound of beef and a hamburger, like those kinds of things, and you're like, whoa, the facts are just too much, man. We gotta change what's happening. So that's for the intellectual thinking people. Emotional feeling, that's like intuition. This is like, you just sort of like know it because you feel it. And that could be like you feel it reflected in other people through conversations, like you're affected. This is more the people who are more like heart-centered and touchy-feely, from less of the moral spiritual side, but more of a like the facilitators in the room who are like, I can read what's going on, the empathetic people, right? So that would be emotional feeling. And the social doing, it's like through acts of, maybe you started by volunteering, and handing out sandwiches or doing food drives or something, or cleaning up a highway. And in the process of doing that, you started feeling like we could do more, we could do better. And that the primary thing you want to do is not necessarily read a bunch of books like me, but really is about rolling up your sleeves and like doing stuff, acts of service. Yeah, so that would be the sort of social. And I think that means social like in a Marxist way, like the material social thing about doing stuff. Okay, so I gave you plenty of time to think about which one you're located in. Are you able to think about what your primary is? Great. So what I'm gonna ask you to do is turn to a neighbor, and you're only gonna have like a minute to share this about each of the following things. A minute to share about which one you're located in, what's your primary, and also what are you reading right now that is pleasurable, that you're reading because you like it and it's fun and you kind of don't want to put the book down, but life intervenes, all right? Blogs don't count. I mean like a book, all right? You're gonna share both of those things. You should do this only in pairs. You could do this in threes if you really need to be, but a group of four is two groups of two. You know how this works, right? We're all facilitators, great. So do that and I'll call you back in 2 minutes. Okay, wrap up what you're saying. Great. So now we have this tool. If you're sitting down to a meal with someone who you don't know, you can be like, hey, so what are you reading? And you know that everyone has to have an answer because I had to interrupt you to stop talking about it. So, okay, show of hands, as your body and spirits allow. You can also, I'm black, so we can do like a call and response thing if that works for you. Who are my moral believing people? All right, yeah, that's wonderful. Where are my Ravenclaws at? Who's intellectual thinking? This is really, I'm raising my actual hand. Yeah, I see you. It's not a competition, it's fine. Emotional and feeling. Wow, we have superpowers, y'all. Okay, yeah. And then who are the social and doing people? Yeah, okay. You guys, there aren't a lot of people doing your work shifts. Those are the people you left back home, huh? I know how it works. I've been living in cooperatives for 20 years. So we'll get to that. I'll talk more about me later. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? So the book I'm reading, there isn't a great way. I think I'm going to have to do this way. And also take here we go. The book I'm reading, I started saying, is called The Dispossessed. And it's a beautiful tale of not just around this physics thing, but taking this idea of dialectics, of this sort of relationship between two sort of opposing ideologies, and it literally places them on two different planets, which is really powerful. I started reading this. I'm the world's slowest reader, so I started reading this a couple months ago. I'm also busy. Don't be judgy. I have 2 kids and 2 jobs. And I was astounded that the first line in the book, it starts with, "There was a wall." Don't try to read it yet. I'll read it. This is not good for your eyes. And I reread the first page like 3 times, which is part of why I'm the slowest reader, because it just hit me in a totally different way reading this in 2018. And the way that she uses this idea of, the rest of the story almost doesn't matter. She's just like, let's start with this idea of walls and divisions and what is the power of that. Whether that's as a metaphor, whether that's as a real physical thing. And then, I feel like I'm beating around the bush. Donald Trump, right? Like, he launched his campaign around this idea of a wall. And then the power of that. Like, that's part of why we are at where we're at, was beginning with division rather than unity and intercooperation and interconnection, right? So she starts with this. There was a wall. It did not look important. It was built of uncut rocks, roughly mortared. An adult could look right over it, and even a child could climb it. Where it crossed the road, instead of having a gate, it degenerated into mere geometry, a line, an idea of boundary. But the idea was real. It was important. For 7 generations, there'd been nothing in the world more important than that wall. Like all walls, it was ambiguous, two-faced. What was inside it and what was outside it depended upon which side of it you were on. This is the last part I'm going to read. This is still just the first page. Looked at from one side, the wall enclosed a barren 60-acre field called the Port of Anares. On the field, there were a couple of large gantry cranes, a rocket pad, 3 warehouses, a truck garage, and a dormitory. The dormitory looked durable, grimy, and mournful. It had no gardens, no children. Plainly, nobody lived there or was even meant to stay there long. It was, in fact, a quarantine. The wall shut in not only the landing field, but also the ships that came down out of space, and the men that came on the ships, and the worlds they came from, and the rest of the universe. It enclosed the universe, leaving Anares outside free. Looked at from the other side, the wall enclosed Anares. The whole planet was inside it, a great prison camp, cut off from other worlds and other men in quarantine. Yeah. So that's one of the things that's been on my mind about what the moment we're in now matters so much, what it is that we're doing, and how the experiment of what we can do behind, God, there was a year where our theme for NASCO Institute was about going beyond the co-op wall. We spend so much time talking about like our kitchens and our couches and our labor charts and our meeting process and our bylaws. And it's like, if we're not interpenetrating with the rest of the world, none of this actually matters, right? And so, yeah, a lot of as I start to integrate the social history with cooperative history and what we do in our own organizations, it's with that in mind, right? That on the one hand, there's something important and helpful about having a boundary and having space to experiment and do our thing, and that we need to actually be breaking apart walls. And that we're literally in a moment where when we started Aorta in 2010, it was years where we would be in workshops talking about the importance of helping people name and recognize white supremacy in our society. And it was like this huge uphill battle. And here we are, like, it's only 8 years later. We started Aorta in 2010, right? So it's only 8 years later, and there are literal Nazis marching in the streets of at least this country, and actually many countries at this point. I spent a bunch of time in Brazil, and they just had this horrendous election a week ago. We can talk about that later also. So what we got next? Okay. So there's the other thing about what we're doing on our side is that, God, it's so tiny. Something like 98% of the energy and the resources in movements that are ostensibly trying to like free our world are all on this opposition side. And, something like a butterfly or a moth or whatever punk version of this critter you would want it to be, probably wouldn't be successful in flying very far if all it had was like the one wing and a tiny little appendage on the other side. And so if we're trying to really get there, if we're trying to get free, we do need to strike some sort of balance. So having not just our movements be oppositional, but also having this transformational component. That's what matters about what it is that we're doing. And a lot of, even my own story, a lot of the work that I do has just always been about, okay, how do we put more thought and vision and energy into this transformational piece? Not we're going to drop out of society, right? But how are we using the stuff that we've now been learning for 50 years to bring that, to share that gift with movements who are saying stuff like, break up the banks, and then there's no vision behind what it would look like or what the mechanisms would even be to divest from banks and tanks is one of the ways that some movement organizers talk about it, but this economy, that's the dig, burn, dump economy, and to invest those resources into what is that world we want? How do we actually govern that? Y'all, we're the ones who have those skills and ideas and models and visions. And then this advocacy piece, well, it's one thing to have those skills, but until we have a platform and a mechanism to actually shift the structure, not just the laws, but the resources, the economic underpinnings of our societies, then it doesn't matter, right? So a lot of our work needs to be about how we merge these things. Okay, this is, don't squint too hard. This is a map. Is PM Press here? Are they tabling, selling books? No? Okay. This is a map that I got from a book that PM Press just republished. I think it originally came out in the late 80s. And then they just put out a new edition this year, I think because it talks about the importance of 1968 in completely reshaping the world. I mean, really the world. And there's a whole bunch of charts and stuff in this book that blew my mind. And one of them that I wanted to pull out, and it's where I'll do a little storytelling, is this is a map. Every one of those are supposed to be stars. I'm sure they just look like a bunch of flies like sitting on planet Earth. But all those little black stars are incidences or moments of specifically student uprisings and disruptions. These were riots, these are sit-ins, these are manifestations, strikes. And he tells this beautiful story, which, I mean, if I were to read it cover to cover, it would take me like 3 years because I'm such a slow reader, but about how students were at the epicenter of all of these social movements. I mean, everything we understand about decolonization, reorganizing the world, really. I mean, there's like, this goes all the way down to New Zealand. Like, what's further than that? And Antarctica, I know. Fun fact, Antarctica, the only continent completely governed by consensus. It's true. I am full of fun facts, by the way. Okay, so this, and there's like a zoom in on Europe because there's a lot going on in Europe, but also, interestingly, some of the highest concentrations are places that have these really robust cooperative movements. Japan, India, right? A lot of stuff going on in Latin America, and of course, the Canadian stuff. I know it looks vacant on this map, but if you zoom in, there's a ton happening in Quebec and Southern Ontario, even on this map. So there's a lot going on there. Has anyone heard this term, the New Left? Some of you are like a little bit familiar. Okay, I feel like it's like my duty, if we're talking about 1968, how it ties to this other stuff, to sort of reorient us to what that moment was and meant. And I'm not going to go too far in depth because this book does that, and some people will touch on this stuff in your workshops and in your like undergraduate seminars and stuff, right? This isn't my job. So the New Left, this was a moment where what we thought of as progressive change and vision got completely reorganized. Students, and this is influenced by a shift in philosophy, by postmodernism, by groups like the Situationists, and even just by this particular moment in post-war, post-World War II, where a bunch of specifically, especially Western societies, had enough space and freedom to sort of rebuild themselves, enough leisure time for young people who weren't encumbered by the responsibilities that, for example, I now have with like children and stuff to chase around, were able to just like focus on just sharpening their mind and their skills, being concentrated in these campus environments to form communities and immediate bonds during the moments of becoming woke. And so that meant that navigating the contradictions of how their societies were run, learning about them together, they were immediately able to turn that into action and to show up on a campus square or just in the streets. And so that created, as sort of like the tip of a spear or something, I don't like weapon metaphors, but you know what I mean, that sort of became an opening for a lot of other people who were disenfranchised, dispossessed, and otherwise were fighting for their rights. You know, many of whom were actively still colonized at that moment. And so that led to, I think within 3 or 4 years of this moment, and this is all just stuff that happened within like an 18-month period from 67 to 68, dozens of countries became free, were liberated from the colonization of Western Europe and the United States. Other things that were happening, the sort of critique about so many things about our lives, our food system, environmentalism, the peace movement, certainly, and peace and anti-war movements, all gained momentum during those uprisings and building on what students started. And of course, there were student-based versions of some of these things. What does it look like to be autonomous? And instead of saying, hey, we want healthy food in our cafeterias, let's just start our own buying clubs. Let's just start our own food co-ops. Let's start or even grow some of the housing cooperatives that already had existed then. Let's learn, as our founders in NASCO did, from the solidarity and the interconnectedness of all these social movements and do a version of that ourselves. We're co-ops. Let's link together, form an organization that will help us be more, build collective intelligence, share best practices, be in community with one another. These are things that we are still learning, in part because of the backlash and the attack of solidarity that was forged in '68 and even in the early '70s. Other things that were happening, people on the left felt like a revolution was imminent. The Democratic Convention in 1968 in Chicago. People, and I'm not just saying revolutionaries, but the state was like, oh crap, there's a revolution about to happen in North America, in Canada and the United States, all over the world. Look at this map. There's a revolution about to happen. And in many of these places, revolutions did actually happen, many of which were fighting back against US imperialism and the CIA-backed coups of many leaders, and many of which failed, of course. So the American Indian movement, the Black Panther movement, or more broadly, Black Power, the environmental movement, women's movement, I mentioned anti-war, but also decolonization. All of those things came to a head in that moment. At the same time, the Federation of Southern Co-ops, is anyone familiar with that? It's helpful if you call and respond something so I know how much to unpack. You are, you aren't? Okay, a little bit. The Federation of Southern Cooperatives merged with something called the Land Assistance Fund. And it basically, to this day, is still the largest cooperative association in the US for Black cooperators. They're mostly dealing with producer co-ops in the 13 states in the Southeast US. And they were formed out of a legacy of sharecroppers, so Black farmers who either had limited access to land, or they were struggling to hold on to it, or they were leaning on the important benefits of cooperation in order to make it work. Not only because they were under attacks from their local and state governments, but also direct attacks from the Klan or for white supremacists in a casual or formal way. We had all varieties of white supremacy in the 20th century. And so they banded together to form this federation, and they created their own education and training camp, institute, grounds. I went there actually for the first time just this year. I don't know what took me so long. But it's out in Epps, Alabama, which is far and very rural. And let me tell you, T-Mobile does not work out there. And so they've been doing training for nonviolent direct action. Civil rights organizers were trained there, going back decades and decades. So being even on that, at that really important site was sort of a rite of passage for me. This past June, we also, I use a lot of different we's. I'll usually unpack and explain who I mean when I say we. Is it like me and my partner? Is it like me and other NASCO people? So this time, we, as the National Cooperative Business Association, which is the apex organization for all the different co-op sectors in the US, we hosted the International Cooperative Alliance, which is like the UN for co-ops. Turns out it's actually the largest NGO in the world, representing over 850 million people who are part of cooperatives all over the planet. So this is cooperatives are feeding everyone, clothing everyone, getting people electricity, responsible for a remarkable amount of the global economy, which is also important to keep in mind when we're thinking about like, wow, the world is like a trash heap. What do we do? Where is our power? It's like, oh yeah, also, we got this. We're actually doing and running a lot of what's happening on the planet. So we were hosting that board in the US, which they hadn't met here since I think the 90s. And they said, yeah, we could go to DC, we could go to New York, we could go to San Francisco, somewhere fancy. But actually, we want to go to Alabama. We want to go to Birmingham. We want to connect with the history of the civil rights movement in the US, and we want to visit the Federation of Southern Co-ops and the Rural Training Center that they have there, which was, it was great. They were really inspired. It was a cool meeting. So all of that stuff dates back to, that's a big part of what we built. Okay, fast forward to the 70s. Most of what I want to say about the 70s was about counterattack, right? So people started building a lot of alternative institutions themselves, mass mobilizations, and a spread of consciousness throughout the 60s. And in a lot of ways, that actually just deepened in the 70s. But as that advanced into practices of people, like the Black Panther Party, like actually feeding people, feeding youth through their free breakfast program, students organizing food co-ops in a new wave of grocery food co-ops, natural food purchasing. The state got kind of freaked out about all this stuff. So they formed a lot of counter-revolutionary infiltration groups and tactics. This was mostly backed by the CIA and the FBI and an organization called COINTELPRO. If that doesn't ring bells, you need to do more reading. What are you doing? Or you need to change your major. So COINTELPRO. It's also where we started the Cooperative Education and Training Institute. That was 1977. So NASCO Institute was launched in 1977. And along with it, we weren't just, the way I'm talking about now, because we're talking about NASCO, we weren't just focused on campus-based housing cooperatives. We also included the food co-ops, the new wave, not the ones necessarily from the 1930s, but the new wave of these natural or healthy food co-ops and buying clubs. They didn't have their own organization yet. And it was actually tied to the same cultural moment and the same cultural movement. And so before the National Grocers Association spun off and became its own thing, they were actually housed by NASCO. That represented the food co-ops and the housing co-ops together. And they participated in NASCO Institute, and we had whole tracts that were just about the food co-ops. Okay, similarly, and I'm starting to get autobiographical, although I wasn't born until 1981, there was a group in West Philly, which is where I live, called the Movement for a New Society. And it grew out of all of these social movements we were talking about, but tied in Philly, which was, of course, founded as a Quaker colony, right? The 13 colonies in the U.S., settler colonialism like primer, just like the 10-second version, were each founded as these religious settler colonist spaces. So there was like Catholic colony, Puritan colonies, we were the Quaker colony. If I've blown your minds already just sharing that, like, you're welcome. So the Quakers, going all the way back to then, founded Pennsylvania, and going back to those days, they had this whole like non-hierarchical thing where there wasn't a minister or a pastor or whatever. It was sort of like you sit facing each other in this circle, much like a house meeting, board meeting, council thing. And they have been using consensus for centuries. And so the Movement for a New Society actually grew out of the left wing of just Quaker organizers. And there's a really great book by a buddy of mine named Andy Cornell. I think it's published under his formal name, Andrew, called Oppose and Propose. And it tells a really cool version of this story of how consensus, as we know it in social justice movements, ties back to not just Philadelphia, but my zip code, like my neighborhood. and the cooperatives that we formed back then. Because these were groups who were familiar with consensus-y things and sort of zhuzhed it a little bit and infused it into movements for social justice with this idea of feminism and egalitarianism and anarchism and socialism, and just having a way of lifting up voices of marginalized people and making decisions in a way that is inclusive and is usually smarter and more informed. Okay, so also you're welcome for that. It's been popularized all around the world now, and that ties back to the work that MNS was doing, the Movement for a New Society. But these folks, that was a bit about their process, but what they did was they originally were doing a lot of nonviolent direct action. They took inflatable rafts into the Delaware River and blocked warships from docking in Philly, either to offload or upload war machine equipment things. And they were like, no, we're not letting you do that. So they blocked them, which was pretty cool. They just got out there in their little inflatable boats and got in the water and literally during the Vietnam War stopped that exchange of military goods from happening, at least in the port of Philadelphia. I'm sure they put it on trains and went up to Boston or something and shipped it. But they got really sick of protesting and saying no. They got sick of being tied to a lot of movements that were just like, stop the bad, right? That thing with the butterfly of the oppositional movements. And they said, what are we even doing if we're not building the institutions that we want? Like, we need to start somewhere. We need to start practicing it. We need to start experimenting with it. We need to screw it up and iterate and do it better. So they started building these alternative institutions. I just moved out of the LCA, which is a land trust housing co-op in my neighborhood that I've lived in for most of the last 14 years. And it started in that moment. The LCA stands for Life Center Association, and they also had chapters throughout the country, especially in the 70s and early 80s. And I think the other big hub was actually up in the Twin Cities and different parts of Minnesota. But they were national and sort of strongest in Philly where they were based. But it was around living together gives us the surface area and the space to practice this new society that we want to live in. Like, we'll really understand what it looks like to recognize the friction around gendered labor when we're living together in a non-gender segregated way, and also sharing in work and reproductive labor and cooking food together, basically doing what you guys do. They also started a couple food co-ops, a credit union, a publisher called New Society Publishers, which actually closed and reopened up in Canada. I think they're still printing stuff to this day. An organization called Training for Change, which in some ways inspired what we did in starting Aorta. They do their own version that's more movement and like train the trainers facing. And Aorta is more like, hire us. And we'll work with organizations doing more sort of internal work. But similar groups, Training for Change still exists. They have trainings all over. They're really rooted in West Philly as well. And so even though the Movement for New Society closed, I'm all the way up to the late 80s now, they closed by the late 80s, the movement itself ended, they built all these institutions. So those institutions endured. They're still there, right? I had a moment where I was actually simultaneously living in the housing co-ops that they started, working at the food co-op that they started, and banking at the credit union that they started. So it was just, in my neighborhood, like on my street, I was able to plug into all of these things and actually use that as a platform to advance this broader work around building the world that we want and need. What else happened in the 80s? Well, this thing called the nonprofit industrial complex got supercharged. So when the violent and direct tactics of attacking social movements through bombing and coercion and divisive conflict inside of movements, when that was unveiled and revealed to be, unconstitutional and illegal and all that other stuff, they kind of shifted from bad cop to good cop. And so the nonprofit industrial complex was actually designed to soften the vigilance and militancy of social and economic justice movements. Giving money, diverting money that would otherwise go, right? So the whole idea of being tax deductible, it's like, this is money, you owe all your tax money to the government. Then the government controls everything. At least in North America, we have these like sort of libertarian-ish societies where the government's like, all right, we don't want to do everything. I mean, we don't want to be responsible for like actually feeding everyone. So we'll just let you keep some of that money if you promise to only use it to do some of the stuff that we would do. So hence this idea of doing things that are like charitable or serve a common good around education or feeding people, et cetera, right? But you're not allowed to like do fierce lobbying and very political stuff, right? Because these are dollars that would otherwise be going to the state. So what ended up happening is philanthropy creates all these different siloed sectors, and you end up having like an environmental justice movement that has nothing to do with a racial justice movement, that has nothing to do with education reform or gender justice, shelters, homelessness, right? So this whole idea of splintering actually is tied to the money, tied to the rise and the fracture of those different movements. So that's part of what we get in the 80s. I feel like I need to sneeze. Yeah, it happened. All right. Late 80s, I think it's like 1988, although probably Jim or someone can correct me. NASCO shifts and innovates this new development tactic where we both found NASCO properties and what at the time was called CCDC. I know Holly Jo's trying to bring it back, which stood for Campus Cooperative Development Corporation. I don't think I've said that out loud in like 10 years. Look, it's still in there. CCDC. Nowadays, it's known as NASCO Development Services. And I think that was an important adaptation of like, okay, what does it look like to go beyond just, we're connected, we have an education and training group and program and way of staying in touch around institutional knowledge to connect us all. But what does it look like to actually develop and advance and continue serving or expand how we're serving students and youth organizing? Okay, so the 90s. The 90s happen. I think the part I want to jump to about the 90s is I'm just going to go right to like corporate globalization. And something that inspired me was in 1994, so I was like 13, I guess then, but found out about it a couple years later. NAFTA was signed into law, and a bunch of Mayan peasants banded together and mounted a movement that really went on to inspire the world in a lot of the same way that student movements in '68 inspired the world. They formed a group called the EZLN, or the Zapatistas Liberation Army Forces. And in doing so, I mean, they literally had like fake guns. I mean, they had guns that were just pieces of carved wood that they like marched into their local capital and said like, we're not down for this. We are demanding a different world, a world where many worlds fit is one way that they put it. And among the many sort of like philosophical, we call it like disruptions now, but sort of like guiding thoughts that they inserted into social justice movements was really around balancing that butterfly again and saying this idea of one no, but many yeses, where so many of our movements are so enthralled with the million things we need to say no to, and there's very little articulation of what the yes is, what is that world that we want. And so the Zapatistas were some of the, in this newer wave of organizing, one of the earlier groups that was able to start articulating like, how do we at least carve out space to dream and to think about and to demand what that yes is. And it was explicitly tied to this economic organizing, right? At the same time, movements, yes, the nonprofit stuff continued, but I think, especially for youth and students, we got more involved in direct action, acting at a local level. And some of the experimentation actually started taking off again. Even some of the food co-ops, which at this point had organized their own, and they drifted away a little bit from NASCO land, they were experiencing a sort of a third wave, and an uptick of, okay, we're starting new ones again, we're expanding existing ones again, and like now soy milk and a plant-based diet, we called it vegan back in my day because I'm old, was starting to become en vogue again, although vegan food in the 90s was rough, let me tell you. I'm one of those old grandpa vegans, so. And I think that, I say part of that because on the one hand, we learned a lot of really important lessons, especially around, at that point, worker cooperatives, which experienced their own new wave, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, but also in a few other parts of the country. This sort of local organizing and intentionality, and this idea of organizing in a sort of ecosystem framework of being hyper-connected and aware of one another, starting to have social gatherings, shared trainings, even being like, hey, we had this big conflict with this dude, he has a lot of skills, but we can't handle working with him anymore. There's enough space in an ecosystem, like someone else can hire him and we'll give you all the like tips about how to make sure you're not fanning the flames of his toxic masculinity. So like there was now capacity to start doing those kinds of things and to start envisioning what later would be called stuff like restorative or even transformative justice. And it's double-edged sword. Why are there so many weapon metaphors in my head? I'm still learning to decolonize. But this double-edged pen is that on the other hand, we still had this sort of left-wing egalitarian or libertarian culture that's very anti-solidarity, and in some ways is a hallmark or an after effect of the Red Scare and McCarthyism and this brutal attack on solidarity and even cooperatives. Cooperatives had a long time where we just wouldn't talk about being cooperatives. We had to code switch and say, we're just serving people's needs. And credit unions were like, we're credit unions, and never talked about the fact that credit unions are actually just co-ops. So, because they were all under attack in the 40s, right? 40s and 50s. And so being able to like reclaim that stuff and be like, hey, we're cooperatives. It's okay. Like testing the waters a little bit, being, is anyone attacking us? And so I think one of the critiques that I have is that there is an element of that culture that persists to this day, of thinking about like, well, my co-op is like my thing, and we get to decide whether or not we become members of this other thing, of a local network or a national federation, or even international stuff. And I think that that's a really dangerous way that we've internalized that attack on solidarity. And I think that we're sunk unless we're able to really link together and build our power. And I think that starts with something as basic as membership. I swear NASCO didn't like put me up to being like, pay your dues, become members. But it's just super basic. It's super basic. How the hell are we gonna fight against Trumpism and whatever, Golden Dawn in Europe and Bolsonaro in Brazil and right-wing populism if we're like, well, I don't know, I'm gonna like choose where my little donation here goes and this thing goes. It's just like, let's start with a base assumption that we're linked, we're connected, we're building institutions around solidarity, and then where our opinion inserts is like, what do we want to do with that? You know, what do we want our programs to be? How are we showing up in union halls or membership meetings or whatever it is, campaigns and coalitions? But we need to be in coalitions. We need to be talking to each other. So that's, yeah, a little gripe I have. And that begins with at least being inclusive. So in the 1990s, one of the first caucuses, actually, membership-based caucuses that we formed at NASCO was the Queer Caucus, which I think dates back to 1992. And then I joined my first co-op in 99, and I came to Institute in 2000. I think I already mentioned that. And when I came, there was some friction because... Am I going to jump to 2002? I am going to jump. Okay. So because Institute, I think it was around 2000 or 2001, there was this really interesting kind of branding mistake that would never happen nowadays. But the theme that was chosen was the many faces of cooperation. The idea being, among the planners and thinkers of the time, oh my God, you guys, youth and students need to understand that like what we do is only one part of the broad world of cooperatives. So there are there's electricity cooperatives, there's solar co-ops, there's worker co-ops, there's like eco-villages, there's credit unions. We can like learn from all these other cooperative forms. And so let's look at the many faces of cooperation. Except that a bunch of people of color came that year and were like, oh my God, we're finally gonna have the conversation and talk about it. And so they came thinking like, we're gonna actually now talk about the many faces of cooperation, meaning demographically, like we actually are more than white hippies, even though that often is the story that's told in cooperative spaces, including in NASCO programming. Our board at the time was, I think, either all white or almost all white, like minus one person. And so was our staff, although that was about to change. And so at that moment, the People of Color Caucus had a very heated meeting, and but it was a productive one where they weren't just like, I'm gonna like flame you on Twitter, which didn't exist anachronistically, but they sat down with like pen and paper in the dark old ages and listed out a set of demands and said like, we have a list of complaints and we can get into it, but specifically here are like 10 or 12 or 13 things that NASCO could do either immediately or pretty soon that would start to meet what we think our needs are around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it included stuff like having keynote speakers who were people of color, having workshops that actually talked about systems of oppression and anti-oppression and anti-racism, but from an intersectional way, where we're also talking about disability justice, and we're also talking, so these caucuses actually linked together, and those demands were passed over to the Queer Caucus, and of course there was overlapping membership, because guess what, some of us are like queer and people of color, it's a thing. And so it was actually co-signed by both of those caucuses, and then brought to an annual general meeting of NASCO. I was oblivious to all of this happening. I was just like, oh my God, workshops, I don't know what's happening. But a few years later, I ended up being hired as Director of Education and Training by Steve Dubb, and then worked with Jim and Holly Jo and Jeanette. We had a little like mini reunion last night of a bunch of us. We were like, hey, I'm getting the band back together. And so I was charged with planning the institute that was the first one since taking that information internally and saying, okay, look, let's really have the conversation where unambiguously our theme, there's no danger of this being misinterpreted. And it was called Facing Ourselves, Power and Privilege in Our Cooperatives, something like that. I also haven't said that in like 10 years. And so there was no question that that's what we were going to be talking about. And that, I think, marked an important shift internally in NASCO. And a lot of stuff changed, including for me. We're going to talk about that tomorrow at lunchtime during a session where we're delving into the history of the Diversity Congress and some of the which was one of the demands that came out of that that manifesto, what language are we using these days? The demands from the People of Color Caucus and the Queer Caucus. Give me another slide. All right, so some things. I think I'm gonna blast through like 5 points real quick. Some things about what matters internally, about how we're organizing, right? So if we have this wonderful tool, practice, community, And internally, we can't even turn to social movements and say, hey, check out what we're doing. It's so useful and productive. And they're like, you mean a bunch of hippies who aren't even inclusive of the queer people and people of color and disabled people inside of your own movements? So no, that we actually had to do that work in order to be able to pivot and be a resource for thinking about how we build the world that we want, right? Wow, that's really hard to read. Okay, so one thing I want to say about that world, right, and this is a departure from, I think, a lot of the traditional sort of like liberal or Democratic Party nonsense. Still go vote. I'm allowed to be critical of mainstream lefties and still tell you to go vote. Is that I think that there was a lack of analysis around all the economic stuff, and when we get down to it, economics is the fundamentals of basically everything. I mean, when we talk about race, even race is an economic phenomenon. We talk about it as racial capitalism. One of my mentors, a woman named Ruthie Gilmore, who's a prison abolitionist and a professor at CUNY, the CUNY Graduate Center, where I did my grad school work. She has helped me understand and kind of popularize this concept of racial capitalism, which is that race actually was invented at the same time as capitalism was becoming a thing. And it's because we needed, because there's no biological basis of race, this is a thing you all know, if not, change your major, that race was invented as this social category because we needed to divide because the man needed to divide people into classes and find a way of justifying whole categories of why are we kidnapping people from this continent and bringing them to this other one, and why are we murdering and exterminating and silencing and erasing these other people on this continent, and who deserves to be part of these different classes of immigrants who are being pushed out from, at that time, the British Isles, and who are sort of the subaltern, sort of underclass indentured servants who don't have access to whiteness yet, but they're part of the settler colonialism class. All of those things were constituted around this moment where they needed to justify this massive, disruptive, and frankly immoral and abhorrent globalized system around an economy. How are we taking people's land, growing certain crops, converting that into capital, sending that back to the metropole, the sort of capital of all these different empires in Western Europe, and eventually in the US as well, and then aggregating that wealth in order to do things like build these standing armies, reinforce colonialism. It's a whole thing. So that's where race actually comes from, and of course race also shifts and adapts throughout time and place. So what was considered white 120 years ago is really different than what was considered white 60 years ago, and even that's different than what was considered white 20 years ago. Interestingly, in the census right before 9/11, so the 2000 census, they had introduced and reorganized for the first time Arab Americans as white, as a subcategory of white, and that absolutely would not have happened if the census years had been arranged in a different order, in a different timeline, where post 9/11 Islamophobia became a new and ramped up racializing category. So in other words, Arab Americans had just been recategorized as white right before 9/11. And it's really interesting seeing things like this Muslim ban and other walls and borders and attacks and xenophobia. Okay, so we have our own version of that, is my point. And we needed to spend the last 15 years, 18 years doing that work. We've done a lot of that work. We're in a very different place now. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done here at NASCO. And it means that we're now in a different position, not just for this cooperative sector, but for cooperatives all over the world, really, to be able to say, hey, social movement people who are looking at what is the left-wing populism version of right-wing populism, we've got a solution and that actually is relevant and accessible to everyone and to more people. Okay, so what did we have? That wealth inequality, it's not actually, I think liberals sort of talk about it as this like accident of our system, like, oh, the system isn't working or something. And it's like, this is the design of our economic system. And so the part you can't read says that it's a feature, not a bug, right, of what our system is built to be. So our system is designed to create and perpetuate poverty, maximize and centralize profit and wealth, externalize waste and pollution, hence all the like, not just climate, but also our oceans are being like boiled, corals dying, all of that, devaluing people, land, consumers, ecology, sometimes even just the quality of products. So it's not even that capitalism is giving us the best goods, but sometimes it's just we've got trashy things that just end up in landfills and oceans. Of course, there's the theft and appropriation of resources and capital to yield more wealth. And as I started talking about, racism, and even the racialization of certain jobs in labor, right? So linking migrant workers, guest workers to farm labor, or the fact that the labor law in our country is designed to exclude, like all the protections for workers, minimum wage, et cetera, are designed to exclude restaurant workers and farm workers, because that was brown and black people work, right? And so when we talk about the world we want, it also is about how do we close some of those loops in our work and our organizing. All right, next. Skip all of this. Oh no, is this like multiple? Go ahead. This talks about the problem and wealth inequality, and one of the things it mentions is that for every dollar that a white family, at least these are statistics based in the US, famous for our incredible racial wealth gap. For every dollar that a white family owns in this country, a Latinx family has 7 cents and a black family has 6 cents. So like that's the gravity of the work that we're trying to do. It's not just like, we want to practice consensus because that's fun sometimes and you have a voice. It's like, we need to talk about the actual material impact of this stuff. Like we are not going to get to full enfranchisement, food security, any of the things, right? Until even like reproductive access and health issues while that gap exists. So if we talk about something like a universal income, I'm not interested in white families having the same right to a redistribution of wealth as families that have, the equivalent of 6 cents on a white dollar, right? We actually have to talk about addressing a racialized wealth gap, for example, as we rebuild the commons. So this gets at some of that stuff. Okay. Okay, our vision needs to be bigger than just settling for small improvements and little demands. And by the way, I'm absolutely in favor of the fight for 15. And, oh my God, that's like so not enough. So we need to move from a framework of resisting to transformation. Next. Success isn't just the structure. So it's actually not enough to just say we want, and this is a very blurry slide that's got a groovy map of, I don't know, like downtown Austin or Ann Arbor or Berkeley or West Philly or something that's like credit unions and a public bank and housing co-ops and land trusts and groovy things. That it's actually not enough to just have some of those elements. Those elements are an important site and practice for some of these things. They're an important proof of concept. But if we're talking about scaling something, like how we address a global economy that's literally chewing up and destroying our planet, then that actually isn't enough. Next. What we need is to actually flip the relationship between people and capital, right? So right now our relationship is one, this is how capitalism works, not just the race part, but it's one where capital is the god. That's not just money, that's like the stuff, right? That's wealth, that's masses of money, that's brick and mortar, that's institutions, infrastructure, right? So right now, everything is set up so that we exist. Even if there's 1%ers in the room, I'm just going to include you in the 99%. Let's pretend you're not a billionaire, okay? So that's the we I'm using. So we exist to serve capital and help this amount of capital become this amount next year and this amount the year after. And it's not just to perpetuate capital, it's actually that capitalism needs to grow year after year, which is why it's unsustainable and why it's gobbled up everything on this planet. That's part of the design. I spent like 7 or 8 years studying capital and capitalism along with anthropology and geography at CUNY. So that's like the TLDR, the too long didn't read version. It's like, that's how capitalism is structured. And what we want is to actually flip that so that capital, we're not saying let's abolish capital. Sorry, in the 90s, that's what the anarchists were saying, and that's what the hippies were saying. And I think that like being woke around economics now is about saying, no, we're not saying to abolish capital. We're actually not even saying that business is a bad thing, which is the thing that we said in the 90s. Like, fuck businesses and corporations. Like, cooperatives are corporations. We're incorporated. We're businesses. This is a very powerful instrument. And what we want is to put people at the center of them and the mission at the center. So another like subway stop here is we're gonna have a panel workshop tomorrow afternoon, where we're gonna look in depth and closer at what worker co-ops really are and how they function and how they're part of this really powerful tool for shifting that and putting capital in service of people rather than people in service of capital. Similarly, there's a workshop right after this one that's looking at building community wealth. And so what is something like this diagram that no one can see? What does that actually look like, and what does that do at the level of the community? And how, we'll talk in like 2 minutes about fractals and bigger visionary stuff, but how does something like this become an example of like a fractal behavior? Fractal economics almost, where inside of a housing co-op, there is mutual aid and sharing and democracy and resource distribution and one member, one vote and all that stuff happening. And then at the level of the community, there's multiple cooperatives that are interconnected. And then at the level of a metropolitan region or a county or a state, you have things like public banks and right, so that we can shift up to beginning to imagine as a composite that what's happening inside the level of your cooperative is similar to how we're governing our whole political economy, right? Okay, next. All right, so getting free, that's the purpose of all this. Getting free requires not just justice. Like, we can't just say, what do we want? Justice. Like, justice is cool and stuff, but that's saying like, oh my God, you had your boot on my neck. Please get your boot off my neck. Like, stop murdering black people in the streets. Right? Justice isn't enough. Saying imperialism is unjust, get out of my country, we want sovereignty, isn't enough to just get the U.S. out of Puerto Rico, whatever. Like, that we actually need liberation. That's a bigger vision, and that's the part where there isn't a lot of visioning happening in our movements, or certainly in like political parties on the left. So, next. Okay. If we talk about wanting a fair and inclusive economy, fair and inclusive doesn't mean without struggle. I think the other critique about that image of this like ideal community is that it has this really neutral utopianism around it. And I think the thing we need to get comfortable with is not just saying, yay, co-ops. They're a great utopia where it's like, yay, co-ops. And they're human institutions where we get to experience all the messiness of our interpersonal, traumas and dealing with like transphobia and ableism and all those, like, we actually get to work on it, and we have to work on it. And that's actually how we get free. And so having skills for conflict resolution, this is actually a slide of a worker co-op of queer women of color who are mostly immigrants who do language interpretation and translation. And they're super awesome. They're called Caracol. They're based in New York, and we just gave them an award at our National Worker Co-op Conference last month for the work that they do as sort of network weavers, being inside of conferences for social justice, trainings even, community meetings, and providing this really important skill around language justice, right? And having us be able to work with each other. Okay, next. All right, and so then that's part of how I ended up forming Aorta, which was, it sort of grew out of NASCO in a lot of ways. I don't know if you knew that. But a few friends and I had been on board of NASCO, on the staff of NASCO, and a couple other friends who were part of my food co-op in West Philly, and another buddy of mine who actually grew up in Ann Arbor. I'm staying with her parents in town. And she and I were in a transformative justice collective called Philly Stands Up that worked on sexual assault situations. This is like, we're talking like ages before Me Too. And that was, we just did this at the community level. There was no funding. This was not a nonprofit. We just volunteered within like punk, anarchist, queer communities and worked on shit as it came up. And Philly Stands Up was the collective that worked with people who had perpetrated violence in sexual assault or intimate partner violence situations. And then we worked in tandem with a group called Philly's Pissed that later became a group called the Philly Survivor Support Collective that worked more directly with supporting survivors of sexual assault and intimate partner violence. We literally formed this group before the term transformative justice was coined by Generation 5, like a year or two later. And so I like accidentally stumbled into being one of these like thought leaders on transformative justice. And I have like published journal articles and stuff on this. And I get emails every once in a while. Someone emailed me from Egypt and was like, our women's movement is really interested in this restorative transformative justice stuff. Can we translate your article into Arabic? And I was like, yes. So they're doing that right now. So we came together, some of us who had these skills around facilitation, education, training, but we're coming from a background in organizing and working inside of cooperatives and social justice movements. And so we had this sort of intersectional Black queer feminist movement analysis right alongside understanding how organizations work, including nonprofits, student groups, projects, and campaigns. And so we formed Aorta with this idea that we can help resource groups to do what they're already doing and do it better. So even if we're doing a financial literacy training or helping people through their budget meeting in a co-op or a nonprofit, we can show up with an analysis as to why many of the non-binary people and women hadn't had a lot of confidence and mentorship around understanding numbers, around feeling supported in that environment. And that has to inform our process of thinking about even something as basic as, we're here to facilitate your process of building a budget, right? So that's some of what we do. Doing a workshop this evening around anti-oppressive facilitation and how bringing that lens toward the work of guiding groups and being in meetings and stuff can be informed by just an analysis around liberation. Okay, so that's some of what Aorta does. It says from the earliest days of Aorta, we've been deeply aligned with the principles and practices of worker cooperatives and the larger solidarity economy. Did I say we're a worker co-op? We're a worker co-op. And we now, so now I own this business that sort of grew out of stuff I knew and experienced in NASCO land, and working with so many of you as our like earliest clients. So thank you for that. We started with like 5 people, and now we're like 13 people, and we have like $1 million budget. It's crazy. I shouldn't say crazy. It is bonkers. Yeah, okay, next slide. Okay, so then my other job is I run the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Back when I was in the staff collective and the board of my food co-op in West Philly, I was elected to the board for the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. Oh yeah, and then back when I was on staff at NASCO, I think it was my second year on staff, I was invited to the founding conference for the USFWC to represent you guys. So I ended up sort of having this interesting vantage point. Like someone joked about me being like the Forrest Gump of like solidarity economy things. They're like, you were at all the things. And I was, and I used that to inform my organizing and my vision. Those things all mattered. Like I didn't mention this, but the same semester that I joined the same month that I joined my first co-op, which was November of '99, I started in the dorms and ran screaming, signed a contract at the Berkeley Student Co-ops, and that same month, a friend of mine said, hey, I just got back from this conference called NASCO Institute in Michigan, and I met these people in Seattle who are part of another co-op because they're all networked together. We're members of each other. And so in 2 weeks, when we go up to Seattle to protest the World Trade Organization, we can just stay with them. Like, this is just full solidarity. They said, bring a sleeping bag, you can stay on our floors. So in fall of 1999, my first semester of college, I was like in the streets, shutting down the World Trade Organization, blocking ambassadors from all over the world, like Madeleine Albright and all these people, being tear gassed by the cops, and practicing consensus and direct democracy, direct action on the streets of Seattle, staying in a co-op, another NASCO co-op, and experiencing sort of the raw power of what is possible with social movements, who were, of course, we weren't just like students in the streets. We were linked together with labor movements and environmentalists and this huge international solidarity. I mean, there were like 80,000 people in the streets. It was amazing. We should talk about it sometime. But so all of those things sort of inform, right, where I'm coming from, where we're going, this legacy of everything from '68 to today and where we're going. All right, so what do? We are the only national membership-based organization in the U.S. For worker-owned cooperative businesses and democratic workplaces. And maybe what's on the next slide? Yeah, so worker co-ops, you get this stuff. Values-driven business that puts workers and communities at the core of their purpose. This is an example in Madison, Wisconsin of Union Cab. Yeah, where are my Wisconsin people at? So Union Cab, taxi company, that was existing and it converted to being a worker co-op in the 80s. They, for example, are driving people to the polls for free all day on Tuesday. It's amazing. Next. In the US, where it's interesting, we sort of have been jealous and inspired by all these strong worker co-op movements in Argentina, in Spain, in France, and but now, especially in the Anglophone world, a lot of people are like, oh, what's going on in the US? You guys are like popping off and growing, and it's really inspirational. And part of that is that in the US, at least, worker co-ops are they used to be used as a way for people like us, like NASCO-y people, to opt out of the traditional economy, to like drop out and be like, I'm just gonna run my own coffee shop. The libertarianism I was critiquing moments ago. Now they're used as a way for people who've been shut out of the economy to opt in, right? So that's young people, that's millennials and whatever. Definitely immigrants, some disabled people, a lot of like queer and non-binary people who just can't find a job that is accepting and respectful of who we are and how we need to show up. And so it's being used as a tool to just like create our own shit. Next one. And so some of who benefits, that could be everything from first-time entrepreneurs to really labor-intensive industries, to contingent and contract workers, freelancers, things like that. Next. And in addition, of course, to the economic participation and governance, we manage all the day-to-day operations, just like you guys do. And in fact, I often talk about my origin story in being involved in all cooperatives, but especially worker co-ops and food co-ops being tied to my time in the Berkeley student co-ops, where we weren't just a housing co-op, right? Like my first work shift was driving a truck around, me and another guy who was vegan, Charlie Datar, who used to be on the board for NASCO also. We met, he was the main driver and I was the assistant driver. We drove around and delivered dairy to the like 23 housing property co-ops in our system. So that's work last time I checked. That's not just housing, right? And we had a big warehouse. We would order in bulk the same way that food co-ops do. And I know this because I worked at a food co-op that ordered less than my student co-op did. and stocked everything, broke down the pallets, redistributed that to all of our houses for accessibility, cheaper pricing, all of that. Okay. Yeah. Some of the things we want. This is sort of an idea of what it looks like to articulate some of the things that we want for the world that we're trying to build. We need technical assistance. We need to insist that we're not just saying what we need is a co-op and then that's the win, but it's all the other things underneath and besides that. That includes divesting from all the bad things and reinvesting them into the infrastructure that allows us to own and control our stuff. Next. This concept of non-extractive finance. So what does it actually look like to reinvest that stuff? Well, we can create institutions that don't rely on debt. What does it look like to lend money? And we have in our network, especially worker co-op, but also I guess they make loans to all kinds of cooperatives. Organizations, there's a group called the Financial Co-op that's being incubated by the working world that can take larger amounts of money and actually divvy it up into these local loan funds where you, in your local community, have control and say in how that gets lent out. And instead of relying on debt and collateral for lending that money out, they just say, we're just going to help make sure that you can repay this. And if you can't, that's fine. I guess it's everyone's loss, but we really want to invest in your community. So we're going to put all kinds of money and people and resources and trainings into the technical assistance to make sure that your cooperative project works. And then when you pay it back, we can lend that to the next project. Next. So I wanted to close on this idea of emergence. And what it looks like to shift away from this idea of militaristic strategic planning to really opening up and being open to possibilities and adapting to our conditions, to the political moment, and seeing what's possible. So this is sort of a diagram that looks at, what if some of your strategy was this green and blue stuff, and even if some of that peels away and you let certain strategies and programs die off, this red and orange stuff becomes folded into what your new plan is and your new direction forward. We can skip through the next few slides. I'll just sort of talk about what they mentioned, but this concept of emergence, it sort of unpacked to these different concepts around using transformative justice, being interdependent, being decentralized, how all of that stuff makes us stronger and more resilient. This idea of the fractal, of practicing things at the smallest level of interaction and intention, and having that grow and scale what it is that we are and what we're doing. So you can keep going through some of these things. It talks about being adaptive, fractal, interdependent, transformative justice. Cool. So the great news is that change is absolutely possible. This is a picture of a bunch of inter-cooperative people, mostly worker co-op people, outside of City Hall in Philly, where we were testifying. And within a year of that picture being taken, we actually passed legislation in the city of Philly to fund worker co-op development directly. Similarly, right, so here we are, 2018, we just got the first national policy that focuses on worker co-ops ever in the US passed. It was just signed into law by Dum Dum in the White House 2 months ago. And it's also the first time there's been any new law that in any way focused on cooperatives in 20 years, since the late 90s. So this is okay, we're actually gaining momentum, we're becoming more relevant, and we're weaving in different strategies of cooperation into that. I think that's the last. What else do we have? You can click through this. This talks about the sort of scale. I showed that map before of student uprisings. This is a map of where there are strong worker co-op networks all over the world who we're connected to. So sort of what does that other version look like of being connected all over the world? What else we got? You can go past that. That's a fractal stuff. Okay, so pause on this one. What I want you to do is you can either close your eyes if you're comfortable, or you can gaze up at this amazing ceiling that's blowing my mind, or you can gaze into the nebula. And we're going to take just 30 seconds to time travel and do a little visioning, okay? And here we are. If you're comfortable closing your eyes, please do that. All right, so you're going to climb into our time machine. You're going to walk up the steps. You got to close the door behind you. Okay. You're going to sit down in a little squishy, very comfortable time travel chair. And you're powering this thing up. And it's blasting us forward 50 years. It's also a time and space travel, so it's 50 years in your community, and you're in the future. And we're there. All right, we're gonna open up the door, and you're gonna explore what this looks like. First, you're looking out the window, see what that looks like. Okay, we're gonna open the door. Has climate change made the air unbreathable? No, it's breathable. Okay, we're in our preferred future. What does it smell like in this future? What do you hear? Do you hear birds? Do you hear people? Do you hear joy? Are there like children playing on a playground? You can move in whatever way works for your future vision of your astral projected body through this world. And just take in some of what that community looks like. What's happening? What do you think are some of the institutions underlying that, or the social relationships of the people there? Yeah? All right, we haven't perfected this time machine, so we got to race back to it, but otherwise we'll get stuck in the future. Lord knows we don't want that. This is too idealistic. All right, so back in the time machine, close up the door, charge it up. It's coming back to 2018. We've landed. We're here. And before you open the door and re-enter, I want you to think about actually two things. What's one thing that you want to make sure to do during NASCO Institute this year? That could be someone you want to talk to, a thing you want to learn about, who knows? But something that's going to help you play your role in bringing about that preferred future. And then you also need to think about, what are you going to do when you get back home, including Ann Arbor, if this is your home. Okay, so think about that. We're going to open the door and re-enter the space. Okay, you can open your eyes now. Here we are together. How was that? We're gonna, I think, pause for questions, but this is another thing besides books that you can talk about with one another and share with strangers what that vision was, because I'm really curious, and I'm sure you're curious for each other too. Thanks so much. So I believe there's a couple mics. Okay. Do you want to announce that?
We're going to go into the Q&A, but if you are a part of the NP or the NDS luncheons, those are going to go on upstairs, so we're going to ask you to excuse yourself from the Q&A portion. Sorry, folks.
Okay. And as we move into Q&A, I'm going to allow me to slip into something a little more comfortable. I'm going T-shirt. All right. Questions. Oh, sorry? I've been asked to plug the caucuses tonight. I believe that there's several different, mostly identity-based caucuses that are meeting this evening after the banquet. Liz has got a mic up there, and I think that there's another one maybe over there on that stand. And we, by the way, will be set up to sell versions of this. This is my T-shirt that's made by several different worker co-ops. One of them makes T-shirts, meaning they actually cut and sew. and make T-shirts. They also made the conference bags. And then there's another worker co-op that actually did the silk screening of our fabulous little motto that says, "Think outside the boss." And then we sell them inside of cooperatives. Okay, we got a question over here.
Hi, my name is Paul from Madison. I thought your talk was great and very insightful, so thank you for that. My question stems from a conversation I had last night with maybe 15 perfect strangers that I didn't know. And we had dinner, and we had a really nice intellectual debate for a few hours. And then it just, at the very last minute, sort of devolved, and it kept me up for hours later. And so I wanted to ask you about it. Basically, a lot of themes have been brought forth today in your talk and over the whole conference. Things like cooperation and inclusiveness and solidarity. But we're also in this period of intense tribalism where none of those themes seem to be apparent, at least in a broader sense. And the devolution of the conversation last night was basically because a group said, we need to burn the other side to the ground. Tribalism is, I don't subscribe to that because I'm right and they're wrong. So I guess my question is, how do you incorporate the themes of this institute?
Got it. Yeah.
With that? Thanks.
Yeah. So actually, I reject the premise, right? Like, I think that the like, there's a left, there's a right I think it's bullshit. Hence thinking outside the box, or the boss in this case. So I think what's really happening is we have the elites and the rest of us. And I think it's in the best interest of the elites. I almost put up a slide actually that shows this image where it tracks from 1968 and it projects forward to 2020. Every 5 or 10 years, the size of the vehicle that could fit the number of 1%ers or billionaires that it would take to balance out the other half of the world. So basically, how many billionaires own as much as half of the population of everyone on planet Earth? And it started with a jumbo jet of 330 people, and it keeps shrinking and shrinking down it projects that by 2020, something the size of those little shuttles that take you to the rental car area that I rode in yesterday, that's how many people you could fit everyone in one of those short bus, school buses. So what is that, 15 or 20 people? And so the idea then that we're divided by the tribalism of left versus right, or what it used to be at the advent of race, white versus black, black versus indigenous, indigenous versus Asian, et cetera, et cetera. I reject that whole premise. We actually, at the core of our fundamental interests, have so much unity and so much in common. And so friends of mine who organize in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is, pretty much surrounded by Trump country. It's a tiny city of 100,000 people. And they say that we don't talk about left versus right. It's bottom versus up. It's what are the politics and policies for the many versus the few? And of course, the Democratic Party, at least in the US, stopped talking that way in the 1990s because they started accepting corporate money at that point. And then they just got kind of caught in that. And so I think that's part of how we ended up adopting some of that language of left versus right. But fundamentally, when we talk about, we got legislation passed this year we worked with Republicans. We worked with xenophobes and homophobes and racists, and it was co-sponsored by 3 Republican senators. And it was passed through the House, and it was with flying colors. And it was signed into law by white supremacist dum-dum in the White House. So part of how we got there wasn't by holding up our nose and saying oh, our politics are so pure and we're not gonna, shake hands with the enemy or anything. It was just they were able to see the common interests in, hey, my constituents also need businesses. We also need a future for not Wall Street, but for Main Street. The legislation we passed was called the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. And so I think that, yeah, absolutely. When they start saying like trans people aren't real people or whatever, they're like the tooth fairy, like whatever those things are, we have to insist that that's not up for debate, right? And I think what our work is in this movement, which is, it's quite lonely. Like most social movements are not talking about how do we build the economy we need that takes care of us and that flips that relationship of capital over people to make it people over capital. How do we build that? What are the mechanisms for that? Whether that's non-extractive finance, some of the solidarity economy stuff, like what does that actually mean? What is it gonna take? It's lonely. And so I think in the process of building out those mechanisms and tools, we have to get much more comfortable with putting forward and code switching, putting forward those ideas, platforms, policy ideas in a way that isn't couched as a like, what is left, what is right, what is progressive, what's conservative, because it doesn't need to be. And a lot of this stuff has broader appeal. And even cooperatives, I mean, most cooperatives are like, most cooperative members in the United States are pretty much split down the middle, like right versus left. A lot of them are Trump voters. A lot of people who get their electricity through rural electric co-ops or who are like white farmers in very rural areas or Farm Credit Bureau or Nationwide Insurance. I mean, there are a lot of really conservative people, and I think that that's fine if it's part of the coalition that we're building to build the world that we want. I think what we need to be able to do is sort of hold this complexity in both hands of, on the one hand, knowing that yeah, we have this coalition work to do, and on the other hand, all the stuff I'm saying about what are the internal conversations around pushing forward this bigger vision of what we internally know we want, and then how do we take that over to this coalition work where we can code switch and be in partnership and strategize with other groups, and then go back to knowing who we are and what it is that we're doing.
Hi, Esteban. Thanks for speaking with us. My name is Alex. I'm on the NASCO board. I was excited to hear you talk a little bit about advocacy for worker cooperatives. I think advocacy is something that we don't always have the chance to talk about. I am giving a session on cooperative advocacy strategies on Sunday. And I was hoping you could speak briefly about maybe some of your advocacy experiences, what's been successful for you, any maybe unexpected tips, ways that you think people here could get involved in advocating for their own local co-ops or maybe movements in the state, provincial, or federal level, and what do you think is your local cooperative movement's next target after your recent advocacy success?
Sure, and I have a really short answer because I think we're running out of time. Can I hear the next question as well?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask about how you create, and thank you for rejecting that premise of tribalism, how you create those internal spaces within a community that recognizes the full community and holds the space for very difficult conversations that ensue.
Yeah, that's a harder question to answer shortly. Okay, I'm gonna start with the first one from Alex, but I'll get to both. The first one from Alex. Here's the thing. It turns out we've been so used to being marginalized politically that we don't do what we just did in the time travel thing, visioning stuff. And so only because I'm a weirdo did I sort of respond with a big, bold vision when I was asked about what it is that we want. And I think, so what happened was in last summer, a year and a half ago, 2017, a guy named, it doesn't matter who he is, somebody who's a representative, super progressive, called us up and said, hey, we hear co-ops are a cool thing, and we've got some young people on our staff, and they're saying we should put forward some worker co-op legislation. What do worker co-ops want and need? And the Worker Co-op Federation has a nonprofit, like think tanky partner, and so they do a lot of our research, and their first response was, well, technically under the Small Business Administration, we need to change this regulation, and we need access to da-da-da. It was all this like super surgical stuff that's been, a thorn in our sides for a while. And while those things were true, they said, okay, cool, so you want us to like change like 7 or 8 regulations? We can put that in the legislation, but what do you want? What's the vision? And I was the only person on the call who was like, oh my God, we want like the big things that they do in places like Italy and Argentina, where they're able to directly fund the movement by using the apparatus of government to fund their work. So for example, they take 4% of the profits of all cooperative businesses and funnel them into an organization or a fund that becomes the engine of cooperative expansion, right? So that's part of how they've been able to scale and get really big. And that's part of why they have, 25,000 worker co-ops in Italy, and we have maybe 500. That they have these different mechanisms. So I was like, we need our version of that. And they said, yes, but in the United States, we need to scale that down. There's no way we can get people to put 4% of their profits in our libertarian culture. But we did get them to agree to 0.5 percentage point, and that's in the draft legislation, which, by the way, was never introduced. And so even just going through that exercise, and it wasn't a thought exercise. This was, in the real world, somebody really in power and leadership in the Democratic Party was like, what do you want? And we were not ready to have good answers. Gave us that opportunity to think through those things as ideas, move them through legislative committees, so they've now all been vetted, and now we can just spend the next 10 years cannibalizing that and feeding it in. And so the legislation we just got passed was just like one of the clauses of this legislation that already passed through a bunch of committees, or like the legislative committees, the like legal nerds who were like, oh, technically the Commerce Department would do this. All that happened. And we were like, here, Senator Gillibrand, here's what we want. Here's the thing that would work. And that sort of snowballed and became the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. So I think that, I tell that story because it's an example of what's possible by just sort of like freeing ourselves to, people are going to be coming to us for ideas for the next 2 generations. Like they just don't have any good ideas. They don't have any new ways of how to structure our economy. Co-ops are at the center and a big important piece of that. And so, yeah, that's iterative. It also applies at the local level. A lot of people have started by getting their local city councils to pass resolutions, even just say, there was one passed like yesterday or something in Chicago saying, hey, we think worker co-ops are great. That's great. At least you get familiar with the legislative process. It doesn't do anything, right? But to have their city council unanimously approve a thing, it gets you in the momentum of what we need, such that when, for example, in New York, a handful of years ago, Bill de Blasio was elected, and similarly, some progressive young person got a job and was hired and was like, hey, I have access to power. What do we want for co-ops? And we were like, just fund our work. We need more resources. And they put $1 million in the budget it was discretionary funding, but they allocated $1 million toward worker co-op development. And we've used that to scale up our movement, which now they're putting like $3 or $4 million a year into that. And that's a big part of how we've been able to grow and do a lot of what we do nowadays. So second question was about how we, oh yeah, the big inclusive question. So, yeah. 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 Right. So I think humility is a big piece of that. We can't move forward without a power analysis. Like, I, as a cisgendered dude, like, I take that with a lot of precaution. I'm like, that means that people who are gender oppressed are experiencing stuff that I just don't have a vantage point on, or I kind of do because, gay things. But it means, like, I just make sure that there's other spaces, right? And I think that there's 1,000,001 versions of that, of like, what does it mean to just take humility, like even as somebody who's like person of color, coming from a queer background, immigrant family, like class, all these other things, like that I still move into the world, not with entitlement, but with humility, because I understand that I'm a native English speaker, that I'm cisgender, like that there's all this other stuff that I've had access to glorious education through public schools and stuff. And so I think just remembering that we all experience, and this is one of the things we say in aorta workshop spaces and facilitation consulting things, we all experience the impact of systems of oppression. We've all been the targets of it, and we all have some way or some moment, even if we're just temporarily abled or we've been part of the dominant language group, we've all experienced being on the side of power in those structures. And so I think that if we start with that premise, it informs how we can carve out spaces to be like, we need to lift up the voices of people who are most directly impacted or marginalized by systems of oppression. We need, we're not entitled to like all be in the same conversation all the time. Like it's okay and fine to caucus and have different spaces for people to check in with each other and articulate what they want. And then we need to be willing to change stuff. And sometimes that's like structural policies and behaviors, and sometimes it's like cultural stuff that's pretty chill about like, things just need to feel different. And that's part of having different leaders. That's part of not just saying, I want to make sure like there's like 3 people of color on your board, but it's like, how are we actually sharing power? How are we redirecting power? And that isn't always saying that we need one beautiful mosaic of like diversity, everything. Sometimes that's saying, let's have a parallel organization that is, women of color led, or that is people who are all Spanish speakers being able to run their own space. And it's not that we always need to be in one room with interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think really plurality and ways that we learn, I learn a lot from my background in ecology and political ecology and these sort of metaphors around fractals. I learn a lot from this idea of biomimicry and how the social structures we create can mimic what we see as resilient, decentralized, sustainable structures in nature. And so that has a lot to do with, how does a flock get into formation? Not because it's one bird going it alone in a stupid libertarian way, but like, no, we can actually be interdependent. We can go, as our logo is, further and faster together. How at the level of a cell can we see the importance of working in tandem and coordinating? That's why it matters to have conflict resolution skills. That's why it matters to have good facilitation. So all of that stuff it needs to be instructive in lessons for how we run organizations, but also then how we transform our society. I think we're out of time, my friend.
That's okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much.